So Django 5.1 was just released, and in this video I want to dive into some of the new features of the framework in this release. And I have the documentation open just now. I've got a link to this in the description of the video. Let's have a look at the section on what's new in Django 5.1. First of all, we have a new template tag, and I think this one will be quite useful. It's the querystring template tag. Now, I'm not going to go over these just now. We're going to see examples in a second. If we go down, we're going to see one of the other main features, and that's connection pools for PostgreSQL. And these are useful because keeping connections open can reduce latency. So the time it takes to establish a new connection to the database can be quite long, and by using connection pooling, that can improve the performance of your application. And the third one, and maybe the best one in my opinion, is the new middleware that we have to require authentication by default. Now, you might be used to a Django project where you have some views that require authentication and you use the LoginRequired decorator. Now we have a middleware that will require authentication by default on all of your views, and we also have a LoginNotRequired decorator. And you can use that when some views don't require authentication. The benefit of this is that in most projects, when you have users logging in, logging out, the vast majority of the views on your website will require authentication. So therefore, you have to decorate so many functions with LoginRequired. This takes the other approach where you might only have to decorate some functions with LoginNotRequired. So depending on your application, I think this is going to be quite useful. And we're going to dive into these three main features as well as this model admin feature that's been added in this video. So let's get started. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, and if you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi page linked in the description. So I'm going to go to VS Code where I have a terminal open and I've activated a virtual environment in Python. And what we're going to do here is we're going to install Django into this environment. So pip install Django, and because 5.1 is now released, you can see here it's collecting that. It's Django 5.1 that we're installing here. And once that's installed, we can clear the terminal and run the pip freeze command, and that's going to tell us the versions of each of the external dependencies. And Django, we have 5.1 here, so we've verified that. Let's clear the terminal. And what I'm going to do now is start a Django project. So Django admin start project. I'm just going to call this my project for this demo. We can then cd into that directory, and I'm going to open this in VS Code. So we've now got this project open, and I'm going to create an application in the project called core, and we can do that using the start app command. That's going to generate that core directory. And then what we're going to do, just to complete the setup, is go to settings.py, and we're going to scroll down to installed apps, and I'm going to add this new core application into the list. So now that we've got the setup started, we can run the Django development server on the terminal, and you can see that that has started. So we now have a project ready to go, and we're going to start by looking at the third of these, and that's the LoginRequired middleware. So let's have a look at that. It redirects all unauthenticated requests to a login page, and your views can allow unauthenticated requests by using a new LoginNotRequired decorator. And as I said, this helps with a common scenario in your Django projects. You might have a lot of views that should only be available to authenticated users. So if you're not logged in, you should not be able to access the view. And in previous versions of Django, you would have to decorate every single one of these views with the LoginRequired decorator. Or if you're using class-based views, you would have to use the LoginRequired mixin. Now we can invert that setup with this new middleware. So we can make LoginRequired by default, and then you can allow unauthenticated requests by using this new LoginNotRequired decorator. So if 90% of your views require authentication and only 10% don't, that means you only have to decorate 10% of the views in your application. So it's going to save a bit of the overhead, a bit of the boilerplate involved in setting up authenticated views. So let's see an example. I'm going to go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to views.py, and I'm actually just going to paste in some code here. So we're going to define a function-based view called secret that's going to return an HTTP response, highly secret content for authenticated users only. And what we're going to do in the urls.py file, if we just clear the comment that we have here, is we're going to import that view. So from the core application, let's import views. And then in the URL patterns, we can paste in a new pattern here to our secret view. So we're loading that view here that we've defined. Now we want this to be an authenticated view, so only logged in users are able to access it. At the moment, that's not going to be the case because we don't have a LoginRequired decorator, and we're not using the LoginRequired middleware that's been added in Django 5.1. So if we go back to the browser here and load up localhost, you can see at the top here, let me make this bigger, we can see the content being returned in that HTTP response. So this is not a page that's restricted to only logged in users. So we're going to use the LoginRequired middleware in order to restrict this. Now just to show the old way that this was done, we would have to import LoginRequired here, and then decorate the view with LoginRequired. Before we can actually use that, we need to also stop the development server. And I'm going to run python manage.py migrate, and that's going to create the session and the user table that are required for authentication under the hood. Once we've done that, again, we can clear the terminal here, and let me try and restart the server. Now, if we go back to this page, we are going to be getting a 404 not found here, and the reason for that is because the page is now login required, so it's authenticated users only, and when we try and access that page when we don't have a logged in user, it's going to redirect us to what's called a login URL. So it's trying to redirect us to a login page, and by default this is the URL for that. We can change that in Django by going back to settings.py here. I'm going to go right to the bottom of this file, and we can define a login URL. And I'm going to set that to a URL called login that we're going to define just now. So let's go back to urls.py, and underneath this view here, I'm going to add a new login view. It's going to call a function called login that we need to define now in views.py. So I'm going to add one more very simple function here, and that's called login. And that's just going to return some text content, nothing special here. If we go back to our page that's got login required on it, we are now redirected to the login URL. So we've got this set up. Let's see the login required middleware. If we go back to the release notes for this, I'm going to go to the page on the login required middleware. As you can see, it's new in Django 5.1. And this is going to redirect all unauthenticated requests to the login page. And by default, that's going to be that setting that we've just added. And to enable the middleware, all we need to do is add it to our middleware list in settings.py. And we can put that after the authentication middleware. So let's go back to settings.py. And I'm going to go back up to the middleware list here. So we've got the authentication middleware here. Underneath that, let's paste in the new login required middleware. And if we go back to views.py and we remove the login required decorator from the secret view, we're going to find that this view is automatically protected by Django. And that's because the middleware is intercepting the request, and it's able to determine if the user is authenticated or not. And then if they are not, it's going to redirect to that login URL. Now we have a problem with the login URL. By default now, every single view in the application is going to require authentication. What we can do at the top is we can also import login not required from that decorators module. And because we need the login page to be accessible for everyone, we can decorate that with login not required. So this decorator is also new in Django 5.1. Let's save this file and go back to our page here. I'm going to go back to the secret URL, and again we are now redirected to the login, even though we have not got a login required decorator on the secret view. That is now being protected by our login required middleware, and it's redirecting us to a login page. Now with just two views in the application, you might be wondering what the point in this is. We've just moved one decorator and changed it to another in the other view. But of course the benefit is if your application has 100 views that require authentication and then maybe 6 or 7 that don't, you can just write the views without worrying about decorators now for those that require authentication, and you can simply add login not required to the few views that actually require public access. And of course, if we need to make this accessible to all, we can add login not required here as well. And this time, if we go back to the secret view, we get the content. So that's two of the new features, the login required middleware and the login not required decorator. Let's now move on to another feature. And if we scroll up here on the 5.1 release notes, it's the query string template tag. Now this will simplify the modification of query parameters in your URLs, and it makes it easier to generate links that maintain existing query parameters while adding or changing specific ones. Now there's an example below here, and in this example what's going on is we have an anchor tag and we're iterating over all of the query parameters in request.get. So for each key and value in there, we're checking if the key is not equal to page, and if that's the case, we're rendering out a query parameter for each key and value. And then finally, after we've enumerated every single key that's not equal to page, at the end we're adding a page parameter and we're incrementing the page number, and this would be using the Django page object that you can pass from the context. So that's quite verbose, and that would actually have to be one long line as it mentions above. So if we go down here, we can actually change this up using this query string template tag. By using this, you maintain all of the existing query parameters. So this entire block of code here in the for loop is rendered redundant. And all we need to do is pass our updated or changed parameters into this query string template tag. It's going to preserve all of the existing ones, and it's going to set the ones that you actually pass in. So let's show this with an example. I'm going to go back to VS Code and I'm going to minimize the terminal here. In the core directory, I'm going to create a templates subdirectory, and let's create a file in here called index.html, and I'm going to paste some code in here. So in the body of this HTML, we have a very simple form with a select, and this select has a name of car and it's got some options for different car manufacturers. Below that we have a button to submit. What I'm going to do is save this and we're going to go back to views.py, and I want to return that new template from our secret view, so we're going to change this up here. At the top, let's import the render function, and then inside the secret view we're going to return render. We pass the request to that, and the template name was index.html. So now if we go back to our application and go to this page, when we refresh, we get this lovely looking form. So let's imagine we have an application where we're displaying a list of cars, and we also have some pagination. And by default, we're on page 1, and the page can be captured in the URL using a parameter p, and we can set that to the page number, for example 1, 2 or 100 and so on. Let's add that parameter p to the context. So what we're going to do in the view is create a variable called p. We're going to look at request.get, and we're going to try and extract that variable p from the URL query string. And we're going to default that to 1. So if p does not exist in the URL, we give it the value of 1. I'm going to set up a context dictionary now, and we're going to pass a page parameter here and set that equal to p. So the page is going to be available in the context, and this is going to be a very simplified version of pagination. We also need to pass the context into the render function as the third parameter. So now in our template, what I'm going to do just below the form is add a link here. So it's going to be an anchor tag, and we're going to set the href now. And we want to basically set this to the same page, but we want to increment that page that we're passing to the context. Now before I do this, actually I'm going to comment it out. Let's go back to this page here and refresh the page. Now if I was to submit this after selecting, let's say Aston Martin, you can see at the top it adds the car query parameter and sets it to the value that we've selected here. And the reason it has the name of car is because the select box has that same name. So that's what's getting added to the query parameter, because this form is submitted using a GET request. Now in order to preserve what's being passed in here for the car, when we add an anchor tag here for incrementing the page, we can use this query string template tag that's been added instead of messing around with the query parameters in for loops like this. So let's see how to do that now. If we go back to the page and then go back to VS Code, I'm going to uncomment this. And what we're going to pass as the href here is the query string template tag, and I'm going to move that up a bit. So it's query string, and what we can pass in here is any additional query parameters we want to use. So for example, if I want to set the page here, I can pass the page in as so. And I want the anchor tag to just say next page within the text content. So let's now save this and go back to our application. We now have this anchor tag. So when we click the link, the page is added dynamically. What we can also do, of course, is increment the page as we would need to if we are getting the next page. And we can do that by using the add template filter in Django. So each time we click the link, we need to add 1 to the URL query parameter for the page. Now I've just noticed I'm calling this page, but in the view here, we're trying to get a parameter p, so I'm just going to change the name of that to page so that it matches what we're sending through here from this query string. So let's test that out. If we go back to the page and we click next page, you can see in the URL here, the page is set to 2, and each time we click the link, that is being incremented. So what's happening here is that we're adding 1 to the page value that's in the context, and in the view, we're extracting that value here, and we're passing it into the context again. So each time we click the link, it's incrementing that page number. Now what we can also do if we go back to index.html is we can update existing values. So for example, to overwrite the car that's in the URL, you can see that at the top, it's set to Aston. What we can do in the query string template tag is we can pass a value for the car, and let's set that to Ferrari. And this time if we go back to the page and let me refresh this page and clear out all of the query parameters, if we select Aston Martin here and then click next page, you can see the page is set to 2, but also the car query string or query parameter is being updated as well. So this is the mechanism for not only setting a query parameter like we're doing with the page, but also for overwriting or updating an existing query parameter. You just pass the key and the value in to the query string template filter, or template tag, sorry, and that's going to work. And we can also remove query parameters from the URL using query string, and that's done by setting a value to none. So let's say when we click next page here to get the next page of data, we want to remove the filter for the car for whatever reason. We can set car to none, And then if we go back to the page here, again, I'm going to go back to this page and let's select a car. When we click next page, that's removed from the query parameters. And finally, we can also add a list to the query parameters. So in order to show that, I'm going to go back to views.py, and to the context, I'm going to add a new key here. So I've added a key of colors and we've got red, green and blue in the list. Let's save this and go back to our template. Let's remove the car query string and we're going to set the colors and we're going to set that to the value in the context, and I'm using the American spelling here. If we go back to our application and let's clear what we have in the URL at the moment, and I'm going to select a car here of Aston Martin. When we click next page, we get page being set to 2. But notice we also have the colors appearing in the query string. Now we've got a list of colors and we have the key of colors for each one of them. So that's how you add a list to the query parameters. The key of colors has multiple values present in the query parameters, all separated by the normal ampersand. So this feature has the potential to be very useful if you're doing filtering on your website based on query parameters and you want to dynamically add and remove and update existing parameters in that URL. So let's now move on. If we go back to the 5.1 release notes, let's briefly touch upon the connection pools in PostgreSQL. So Django 5.1 has introduced connection pool support for Postgres. And the reason for that is that the time it takes to establish a new connection to the database over the network, that can be quite long. So keeping connections open, that can reduce latency. And that idea of keeping a pool of connections available for your application to connect to, that's known as connection pooling. Now to use a connection pool with 𝗖𝗵𝗽, I never know how to say this, but it's basically the Postgres driver for Python. What you need to do there is set the pool option inside of options and set that to a dictionary that's going to be passed to connection pool. And if you want to use the default settings, you can simply set pool to true and it's going to use those. So if we look at this here, we've got a databases setting as normal in a Django application. The engine is PostgreSQL and we have an options dictionary here, and that allows you to configure Postgres using these options. And what the option that we've got in 5.1 is this pool option. And that, as I said, can either be set to true if you want to use the defaults, but what you can also do is pass your own configuration essentially. And you can specify the minimum size, for example, the minimum number of connections to keep in the pool, the maximum size, and also the timeout. So you might notice a performance benefit if you're using pooling in your Django applications when connecting to a Postgres database. Now I'm not going to demonstrate that, we don't have Postgres set up or anything, and I think it's outside of the scope of the video, but if you are looking to improve performance, you might want to look into connection pools. Let's go down here and we're going to look at the minor features now. And there's quite a lot of these and they're very specific, some of them, so I'm not going to cover all of these. But what I am going to cover is this one, just because I think this one looks very useful. So the model admin has a list display field that you can use. And this now supports the double underscore lookups to related objects. And that will allow you in the Django admin, if you have an object list view, to look at the foreign key fields and look at the values from those very easily. Now, in order to demonstrate that, what I'm going to do, or what I have done, is if we open models.py, I've added a model here called pet. And that has a simple name field for the name of the pet and also a foreign key to Django's user model. Now I've already created the migrations to actually generate this database table. And what I've done in admin.py is I've added a very simple pet admin class that inherits from model admin, and we have registered that, as you can see in line 7. Now what we can do is go to the admin UI and you can see the pets model has appeared here, and if we click that, we currently don't have any pets. Now I'm going to add one just now. And let's give the pet a name of Milo, and we're going to link that to the admin user, and we're going to save this. And you can see the list display, we now have the pet appearing in the list, and that by default is the string version of the object. Now what we're going to do is go back to the admin.py file. I'm going to remove the pass statement, and let's just start with the pet's name. So we want to show that instead of that stringified version of the object. So we can use list display and we set that to an array or a list in Python, and we're going to use the name field on the pet. Now if we go back after saving this and refresh the page, you can see now we get the name, which is Milo. But let's imagine we also wanted to show on this list page the actual username of the user who has that pet. Now in order to add a foreign key field to this list display in previous versions of Django, what you actually need to do is write a function in the model admin class, and that uses the admin.displayDecorator, and you can pass a description into that for what's appearing at the top in the column of the table, and then you can define a function here underneath that decorator. So for example, I'm going to call the function username. That takes the object that we have, and in this case it's going to be pet objects. And to return the foreign key value, you can return that here. So the object has a user, the pet itself will have the user that it belongs to, and that user has a username field. After you've written the function, what you can do is you can add username to the list display. So we can add that here and then save that and go back to the page. And now you can see the admin username has appeared in the list view. Now it's much easier to do using this new technique. We can simply use the double underscore lookup. So let's go back to VS Code now, and we can actually just entirely remove this function. And inside list display, what we can do is we can look at the user field that's on the pet, use the two underscores to get the related object or to reference a field on the related object, and the field we're referencing is the username. So if we save that and go back to the page, when we refresh this page, it's very similar to what we had before. We can see the username here. The title has changed, but if you're not too bothered about that, then you can simply use these lookups as you can see here. So in my opinion, that's a nice one. It cuts out a lot of boilerplate in order to view the related fields inside your admin list display. And that's really all I want to cover. There are additional changes from Django 5.1. So some changes to the auth module, the GIS module. I should maybe say application, not module here actually. And as well as that, we have changes to Postgres, sessions, and much more here. So you can look through this. There is a link in the description. If there's anything in particular from this release that you want to see covered, we could maybe make some follow-up videos, but that's going to be all for now. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for much more Django and other content. And if you want to support the channel, as I said at the start, we have this Ko-fi link in the description. It would be amazing if you want to contribute to that. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.